Thank you all for being here. If you didn't get a chance to drop into the chat where you're joining from and what the weather is like over there, please go ahead and do so. We're going to go ahead and get started in the meantime. So thank you so much for being here for this chat and learn. So just some friendly reminders for us during this event. So please, we encourage you to participate. Turn your cameras on. This event is being recorded, so you will show up on the live recording. I just wanted to flag that for you. But again, we love seeing who we're speaking to and who we're really interacting with. So please do turn your cameras on if you're willing and able to. As I just mentioned, this is being recorded. We will be sending an email with the link afterwards. So just be mindful of that. Also wanted to encourage folks to interact and engage in the chat. If you do have a question or a thought that you would like to be shared anonymously, you can message me privately in the chat as well, and I can ask it on your behalf. And then also keep up with us on social media. Again, this event is being put on by Power to Fly, and so you can see our YouTube channel and you can subscribe to that here as well. So just also a quick introduction of who I am. My name is Zara. I am a global DEIB strategist and trainer with Power to Fly, and I'm very excited to be talking to Vanya here today. So Vanya Wryter is a workplace training consultant who has found herself in some unusual and memorable workplaces in the name of workplace education. After traveling to remote regions of Canada to standing at the top of high rises still under construction, she has gathered over 10 years of experience learning about people's jobs and designing training to improve job skills. She has worked for startups, entrepreneurs, colleges, not-for-profits, government agencies, and various companies to improve the efficiency of training and business operations processes. Vanya, I'll kick it over to you to quickly just introduce yourself.
Yeah, this whole introduction there. What I want to add is the fun part for me is being able to interview people about what they do at their jobs. And it's so interesting when I go to the workplace and say, what do you do here? What's this? What's this document about? And they're thinking, well, this is so boring. Why do you want to talk to me about what I do every day? And I'll say, but this is fascinating. That's a notice. What do you do with it? I said, well, it's just something we do for this. And they sound so bored. I'm so excited, like I've never seen the notice before. So that's why I really like workplace education, is getting to know people and what they do. And from there, that's how I got all this experience about how to write better documents.
I love that. Thank you, Vanya. And thank you for bringing in the fun part of your job as well. I love that. And I'm excited to kind of dive in a little bit deeper on that today in our chat as well. And just wanted to share some main takeaways for today. So just flagging that you are eligible to get SHRM credits for this. So you can see the code up top here for that. So just the three main takeaways for today before we dive into our conversation. So one, we're going to be talking about ways to design documents and signage to really transcend cultural barriers. Two, we're going to be talking about language to simplify communication and understanding. And finally, the importance of plain language and logic in written communication. So those are going to be our three main takeaways for today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to go ahead and kick off our question portion of this. So Vanya, I'm really excited to dive into this with you. So my first question for you, what is plain language and why is it important to use it during the communication process? And how do you add legally required language to a document but still reduce language and cultural barriers?
That's a good question. Plain language, short answer is, it is when you write something and people can understand it clearly the first time around. And that's my main tip about design documents, especially if you're working with international audiences, is to choose words that have one meaning. And one example of that was one of the clients I was working with. She said, check all the answers. And I was thinking, check has more than one meaning. You could say check and review the answers. Do you want me to review the answers? Or do you want to put little check boxes next to the correct answers? So that's what the most important thing about plain language is, to make sure the words you're using have one meaning. And when you have one meaning that's clear to the person, they don't have room for other interpretations and misunderstandings. For legal language, it is I worked with the law office before. It's very difficult to write legal language any simpler, because you could end up some legal ramifications if it's not explained properly, because a certain meaning in legalese is a certain meaning. So I would say there's a few ways to deal with that. Either you have a glossary to explain the term, or you can say the legal term and then next to put another word in everyday English in brackets, or define the term by saying the word and then comma on that word, or just try to say it as clearly as possible. And I do have an example here. It's done by the Law Society. I'm in Canada. And it's a little bit too simplified, but you get the idea here. They're trying to explain mediation for English as a second language speakers. And they say for mediation, if two people can't agree, they can ask a mediator to help them. So you can make it almost like a story type form. So I'd say try to make it as clear as possible, but for legalese or legal language, it is very difficult to explain any further. So I would say, in addition to giving extra explanations about the words and trying to make it as clear as possible, you could have the language in different forms. Some people find it easier to understand something when you say it. So you could do something in a video form, someone speaking to them, and then have the same content in a written form for people who struggle with reading something in another language.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And thank you for being honest about that and about like the challenges that might come with that. I think that's really important to flag. So what can we do to simplify communication with a diverse team? Do you recommend sharing information in different languages to the team?
That depends on how big the team is. If you have a very big team, they have different departments located in several countries, for efficiency's sake, it may be easier just to communicate in different languages. But the downside of that is you end up splintering people into their own groups. So if I know so-and-so over there speaks Spanish and I speak Chinese and I'm not very good at my English, I may be discouraged from speaking to that team member, especially if they're in another department. So you end up, in a way, segregating people by language. If possible, you want to try to get people to speak in the language, for example, English, that the whole company uses, but have ways to introduce concepts in a more simplified manner. If you can, for example, it may not work in an office where language is very, very important, but in a company that was producing materials, they did have a problem with the managers not being able to speak to the people on the shop floor. The shop floor is speaking one language, and then their supervisors spoke the language of the people on the shop floor and the managers who spoke English. Now, what happens there is that now you have the managers and shop floor people no longer communicating with each other. They need that person in the middle. So what we ended up helping them with is, because it's a very physical job, they're on the shop floor making things, was we started making signs in simpler English to show the processes, so that then they have this way of communicating with everybody when they have certain terms that they have written down. This is where you do this, assemble this, and they have certain words written there in English. So now they have the terms to be able to speak to the managers, because you don't want the managers to be isolated from the people on the shop floor and not being able to speak to each other. So that's the best answer I can think of in the short term.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting also because, you know, Vanya, I'm on the DEIB team, right? So we always talk about like different ways that certain workplace settings or processes can like really perpetuate misunderstandings between people. And I think language is a big part of that. So like even what you named about people on the floor potentially speaking a different language than those in like more leadership, that only like perpetuates more challenges. So I appreciate you kind of naming that. And I think it's interesting how language like really plays into that. So so what about, is there a way to teach, so someone asked, is there a way to teach my employees to use plain language in their communication? What do you recommend around that?
There's a whole, I can say whole thing. It's funny because I work with language and all I can think of is the same thing, but there's a lot of resources out there on plain language. So if you want to learn how to speak in plain language, you can Google search that, and to have things such as, here are some verbs and how to say them, how to choose words that only have the one meaning, because that's the most important thing about plain language, is to avoid multiple meanings. So you can find resources about how to teach plain language, how to communicate in plain language, how to find a list of words that are best for using when you're doing plain language communication, because those words have one meaning. I even found things like what words to avoid, because these words have 4 to 5 different meanings. And you want to avoid that, especially if you're writing a short sentence, and it can be so easily misinterpreted because there's not enough context around that word. So yes, you can encourage people to speak in plain language and learn how to do it by you can take courses, or even there's a lot of free resources out there about what plain language is, what words are used for plain language. And of course, it's usually the simple words that have one meaning. You can find lists about words, what to use for that. To encourage it in the workplace, when you see each other saying something, and it sometimes comes up from misinterpretation of something, you realize, such as my example about check the answers. You can then give feedback and say, is this check the answers, is it review the answers, or put little check marks next to the correct answers. When you get that kind of feedback, you know, all right, then that was not plain language. I need to find something that has only one meaning. Or give feedback to each other and say, okay, like, could you review my email, make sure it's written in plain language, and they can give feedback to your coworker and say, well, this could be misinterpreted as this, or this could have extra meanings. And you may not know that when you're writing it. If someone's giving a presentation, you can really focus on plain language and give the feedback and say, well, when you said this, it could be interpreted as this. Or record yourself if you're working on that as your own goal. When you're giving a presentation, okay, did I say something that could have other meanings? Or when you're focusing on plain language, when you're writing your own email, go back and not just check your grammar and spelling, but now go back and say, okay, how can this be misinterpreted by someone? And one tip is to write shorter sentences. 15 to 20 words is a good sentence length. So the shorter the sentence, the less likely it is to get misinterpreted. Because when you have long comma, this comma, that comma, lots of groups of ideas, people can get confused. Okay, this one is modifying this, or is it modifying that? And they get confused about the meanings. So think of it as bytes of information. 15 to 20 words for a sentence. This sentence is one idea. Okay, next idea is the next one. And that way it's clear the first time when they read it, what the idea is, and that is part of plain language.
Yeah, that's great. Those are some really great tips, actually. And also it's good to know that there are so many resources already available for folks when it comes to plain language and like lists of words, like you said. So that's great. Thank you for kind of letting folks know to get some education in around that. Yeah. So the next question for you is, when a cultural communication barrier occurs, what verbiage do you suggest an employee or manager use to really bring awareness to that barrier?
For me, I had something that happened, I don't know if this would help for the answer, where they didn't know there was a cultural barrier. So in that case, what happened to me was people look at me and they think, oh, I'm born in Canada, so I must be Canadian. I embody all the Canadian values, which is not true. I also grew up in an Asian household. So I actually have two values in me. And what happened was I just started working for this company for 1 week and is remote. So they haven't really met each other until we had our first team meeting in person. And at the end, everyone had this culture of hugging each other. And so my boss hugged me, and I did this so polite ladies hug, and he's male. And then he said, well, that's not a good hug. He likes to do the brotherly bear hug. And I felt uncomfortable because he's my supervisor. I'm a bit Asian. We have this respect your supervisors, respect your elders. And I felt uncomfortable after just working with him a few days to just bear hug him like he's my brother. And I felt that was not appropriate. It's not showing him the proper respect. If I had been working with him for a much longer time, maybe I'll bear hug him. He's my brother, even though he's my boss. So I felt very uncomfortable. And then everyone says, that's not a proper hug, do it again. And then, nope, do it again and again. Properly bear hug, and I felt so uncomfortable at the end. And then he took me aside and says, this is not team spirit. And he said that in the hallway where people could overhear, so I felt so embarrassed. And he kept saying, you, try not to point things at people. This is my first tip. You are not showing proper team. This is not how the team behaves. You have low self-esteem. I said, no, I don't have low self-esteem. I grew up partly Asian, and I am trying to show you respect by not bear hugging you like you are my brother. You are my supervisor, my boss. I'm going to show that I respect you a little bit above me. Maybe if I know you longer, then we can get into that really chummy kind of atmosphere. And I just felt so embarrassed because he kept pointing fingers at me, making conclusions. And so my tip is, don't point at the person and saying, you are not performing as a team player. You have low self-esteem. It's like, how do you know I have low self-esteem? We worked that lesson 7 days together. And having him point things at me was not a great feeling. And I felt so embarrassed because everyone could hear this, although he was taking me out to the hallway. So I would say open communication. You never know what the other person is thinking. You don't know how the person was raised, what their culture is. Even though they may look like a certain nationality or culture, it doesn't mean that's how they were brought up. They might be from other cultures. So ask questions instead. So I would prefer he look at the behavior and say, I noticed that you didn't feel comfortable hugging me. What is the reason for that? If he'd opened it up to a conversation without finger pointing, he would have then gone to the discussion with me. I would have felt more comfortable talking about cultural differences and say, yes, I am Canadian. Yes, I grew up in Canada. But when it comes to touching people, I'm very Asian. And I felt I was showing you respect by not grabbing you and hugging you like you're my brother. And if he'd asked me questions, I would have said that to him, and that would just clear the air, and he wouldn't have then concluded that I had low self-esteem. I don't have low self-esteem. I'm showing him respect, and he's saying something else. So I would say open communication, begin by asking questions. If you know a certain culture group is going to be working with your company, look into it. For example, when I was an employee, we were starting to work with a First Nations group. And so I started looking into what challenges they have. So I understand when someone comes into my classroom, why they're not focused. It's something happening at home. Then I'll ask a question, always ask questions. So how are you doing? What's going on in your life? How can I help you? Rather than pointing fingers and say, I noticed you're late to my class. You're not focusing. Why are you doing this? Why that? So be open, find out more, or even just be open to saying, I want to learn more about you as a person, because we don't want to say, okay, Vanya's Asian. What is an Asian person? So I can figure out how she behaves as an Asian person. Each person is an individual. So I just ask, what's going on? We have a culture, back to my scenario, we have a culture in our group where we hug each other. I notice you're uncomfortable. Why were you uncomfortable? What can we do to get to that level where you're comfortable hugging me? And I said, well, if I know you longer, more than 7 days, as my boss, and I feel we really get along with each other, maybe I'll start hugging, but right now I don't feel comfortable doing that. Yeah.
Oh my God, I have so many thoughts with that. First of all, I'm really sorry that happened to you. It's not fun being on like the receiving end of assumptions and biases and accusations like that. So I'm really sorry that happened to you. Also, like, your boss was not being a very good ally in that moment, right? And kind of like assuming that you have low self-esteem, when really, again, there was a cultural barrier there. Yeah. So I really love what you said. Again, these are all topics and themes that come up a lot when we talk to companies about like DEIB in general. And I think like what you really nailed it when you said it's all about open communication, right? Yeah. But also not like what your boss was demonstrating was kind of hurling accusations at you, right? Yeah. Versus an invitation. Like you said, if he had asked you a question, like, I noticed this, like, can you tell me more about that? Like, imagine how different that conversation would have gone, right? Yeah. And it would have been like a learning moment versus it just added to your, like you said, you feeling uncomfortable. And now it's like embarrassing because everyone can hear you. Like there were so many better ways that conversation could have really happened, So again, I love what you shared. And I think you have some really great takeaways on like how to approach a situation like that and really show up as an ally, which I think your boss in that moment was not really able to do that for you.
Especially have open communication and never make assumptions. I think the problem was he assumed I was born in Canada. I'm Canadian, therefore I embody every single Canadian value, which I don't. A lot of people now, they come from different cultures, different backgrounds. Right. So I always be very open and don't make assumptions. And then when you have that kind of not finger pointing, not making assumptions, people are more likely to say things. And in my case, I just started my job. I was so scared of being fired that I said nothing. So always be open. So if you're not sure about the culture, you're not sure how to approach a certain culture, just show a very open type of atmosphere and show them that I'm not going to judge. Just tell me more about you. I'm here to support you.
Right. Yeah, it's that invitation, supportive environment, And I also love what you said about focusing on the problem and not the person, right? Like it's not you are this, it's more like I noticed this action of yours, right? It puts people less on the defense for sure. So yeah, that was another sort of great tip. I also just want to flag, like Vanya put a great book recommendation in the chat. I also recommend that book called The Culture Map. And then, Pat was just kind of naming, not needing to have to explain to someone why you don't care to hug them, right? It's not necessarily part of the job description. But again, like you mentioned, Vanya, perhaps that's part of the Canadian culture, right? So it's an assumption that people are making that, like you said, you are embody all of those values, which is just not true. So yeah, thank you for folks kind of dropping thoughts in the chat. Also, if you have any questions, drop those in the chat. We'll have some time at the end to kind of address audience questions as well. So please keep those in mind as we move along. So my next question for you, Vanya. So how to best monitor or check in with remote workers to see if they feel heard, seen, or perhaps discounted in meetings?
Sometimes where you have a huge department meeting, people turn into a number. And so it makes sense. One thing I got from one of the teams I work with, I'm 100% remote work, is developing a rating system. And unfortunately, I forgot the exact numbers, but it's a rating system out of 10 to decide if someone should be at a meeting or not. So when they finish the meeting, you rate as how useful, there's a whole bunch of different factors, but basically it was how useful did you find this meeting? If you're rating it a 1, then maybe you shouldn't be at the meeting. For example, I'm not in accounting. I should not be sitting at an accounting meeting. So I'd say, okay, this meeting I would rate as a 1. That means I shouldn't be there. And so if someone rates something, a meeting, say, oh, I do a lot of instruction work. And if they're talking about new upcoming projects that I'll be working, of course I should rate it as a 9 or 10. And if I rate it that high, that means I should have been at the meeting because it's relevant to me what's going on. And also if I say, well, it wasn't quite a 10 as a 9, then that's a time when the person who's running the meeting can then say, okay, what caused it to be a 9? So usually we have a quick wrap up in the meeting. I say, well, for one thing, I didn't have a chance to say my opinion. Or I think I'm a little bit concerned that the deadlines are too quick. I already have a whole bunch of things on my plate. So it gives a chance to do feedback when you rate the meeting low, that people say, well, why are you at the meeting? Why do you think it was not a perfect meeting? How can we improve? So that gives a chance for people to improve on the efficiency and effectiveness of every meeting, when people can rate it and say why they didn't give it a perfect mark. How can they improve so that everyone gets the right amount of say in everything? That's more like a company type meeting. But in terms of someone having their own personal issues, they're not feeling heard, they're concerned about something, they feel like they're always last, especially when you're working remotely. Say, well, everyone seems to know what's going on and I don't know what's going on. Oh, someone is going on vacation and now I can't work with them. What's going on? Because I was doing a project with them. So it helps to have with your supervisor that regularly scheduled one-on-one meeting. So I do have that with my clients where they speak to me once a month, and all they do is she asks, what are your concerns? Is everything going okay? And because it's just me and her, and she's very open, back to that thing about my boss, she's very open and she doesn't criticize just what's going on. Let's just have a chat, and her approach is like she's my friend. And she's very open to what's going on, how's this going, how's it going on the projects. And that's a way to check in with them in case they're having some personal issues or saying, oh, I'm having some health problems and where it's going to affect my work. When you have that kind of open communication, it's very non-judgy type of boss. That one-on-one meeting is a chance to then touch base and find out if there's something going on in the person's life that could be affecting their work. Or they could say, well, I'm having trouble communicating with the coworker. I feel like she's not respecting me. That would be the time to then bring it up at the one-on-one meetings. So I've got the 2 ways of touching in with people, is rating the meetings when it's very project oriented and making sure that they're being heard. And if they have a concern, they can then say it so that when they're saying it's not a 10 out of 10 meeting, they can bring up what's going on. Or if they rate 1 out of 10, then okay, this person shouldn't be there. She's not an accountant. What's she doing in the accountant meeting? So they'll say, okay, this is not effective. Let's get the people who are not to be at this meeting, so not at the meeting. Touching base with them. Other ways is, for example, a company-wide meeting, I don't need to sit there for 20 minutes learning about what's happening in the finance department because I'm not involved. I could be doing my other work. So some of that could be information can be given to your remote workers in different ways, such as, okay, here's a little newsletter, what's going on in the company. I can just read it on my own time or read quickly rather than listen to the whole chat back and forth. So in the newsletter, so here's a summary of what came up. This is the most important thing that everybody needs to know. They don't have to sit through the whole chat for 20 minutes about everything happening in the accounting department. So you have different ways of getting people involved. Quick reviews, newsletters. They don't have to be involved in a long 20-minute chat. They just read 3 or 4 bullet points. Department meetings, which would involve the people in the department because it's the project they're working on, and one-on-one meetings to touch base with each person so that they can be aware of that person's what's happening with them if they feel overloaded with work and they're not feeling isolated and on their own island. Another thing I found was for department meetings to start off with a quick icebreaker so that you're not staring at all these people you don't know. I found that awkward when you suddenly have a meeting, you don't know the people that you've been working with because all you've been doing is chatting with them through some kind of app. So the person who's leading the meeting usually just had a quick chat about the weather, something very you don't want to talk about politics, something very, very easy to chat about. So, oh, it's been so hot. Or, oh, the funniest one that stuck in my head, she's looked outside, there's a construction. I see a potty, one of those porta potties flying through the air because the crane's moving it. We all laughed about that. But it's a really nice icebreaker to say something informal and just people can relate to the joke. And you get to know about the person. Say, oh, today I walked my dog. Oh, that person has a dog. I didn't know my coworker had a dog. And you miss that kind of water cooler commentary and conversation when you're working remotely.
You shared like 10 amazing tips in there. So thank you for that. I think, I love the icebreaker type of how do we get folks to connect on more of a human level, right? And not just talking about work. So I love that. I also loved what you suggested about ranking meetings, right? What a great way to almost get feedback as well on meetings, right? And also to determine are the right people in the room for this meeting. Like I love that tip as well. So many great tips coming at y'all from Vanya. I'm loving this conversation. Thank you again. Yeah, this has been like super enlightening for me, and I'm sure for the audience. And again, just want to welcome audience members to continue engaging in the chat. And also, if any questions are coming up in your mind, please drop them in the chat so we can get to them in a little bit. So Vanya, the next question for you is specifically around onboarding international staff members, and what strategies would you suggest around that?
Before we onboard international staff members, I think it's good to be aware more about the people that you're onboarding. For example, if you're onboarding people from Asia, get to know a little bit about the culture. And like I said, don't brand them that way. So, okay, you're Asian, you must be this way, but get to know a little bit about what happens to people who work in Asian companies, what are some issues you should be aware of that could come up. For example, one of the clients I worked with, there people who came from villages were not as tech savvy and they had trouble with communication. And so I was trying to help them with some standard operating procedures and some onboarding procedures for those employees. And I started discussing with one of the supervisors about, okay, from people from villages, do they have more trouble communicating? And then I noticed a little bit of silence. And then I realized that because some of the managers are also from the village and they didn't want to feel like, oh, I don't have a communication problem just because I'm from the village. But it is important to discuss these kind of things. So have a way to learn a bit about what happens beforehand and only address it as the issue, not the people. And I'm sort of going in a loop here. So once again, it's about not making assumptions and being very open. And then if there is an issue, just talk about it as an issue and just say, I've noticed that in some of our tests of employees, the people from villages tend to have more issues with tech. I've noticed that the people from villages tend to have more issues with communication in English. And it's just my observation. And if I word it that way, then people, they notice that and you feel like, but at the same time, the way I worded it, they notice that I'm just observing. And what can we do about it? So I said my observations of what can we do to address this so that this doesn't happen with the team. So I'd say first do your research, be aware of the issues, but don't make that the what you work on in terms of how to onboard people. It's like they always have this kind of group always has problems with lateness. Okay, let's address the lateness issue and build that in because they're going to be late if they're from this place. You're going to do that, but just be aware of it so you know how to start the conversation. Then when you're onboarding people from other cultures, I don't necessarily know people from other countries, what kind of things they could be dealing with. And also each person as an individual is different. So when I'm onboarding, I do already have things in mind about what to address. And I do have my standard procedures for onboarding a new person or a new team from another country. But at the same time, I want to be able to have the onboarding call to get to know that person and see what kind of concerns they may have. So for example, with remote teams, they may say, well, I'm not available between this time and this time because I have to look after my child. You don't want to say, oh, you're from this country and therefore this could be an issue with you. They have their own things that they're dealing with. So I always try to be as open as possible and get to know. First, if you're onboarding a team, onboard the team, tell them about what expectations are. If you're aware of certain issues that come up, like I said about the people from the village, address that and say, these are some possible things that could come up. And also onboard people as individuals so that you know what that person could be dealing with as a possible issue. Issue being things like, well, I'm not available certain times because of personal commitments to my children or other things. They have classes and so on.
Yeah, I love that. It goes back to what you were saying about, like, it's important to recognize that there's information around different like cultural experiences that people have, but you can't just assume that every individual is going to feed into that, right? Or that's going to impact. So I love what you said about self-education in terms of learning a little bit about things that affect like different cultural groups, but not assuming that every individual that you would be onboarding is actually going to be impacted by that. Like I love both pieces of that, right? Look at the person as an individual, but also just be aware of larger things at play there. So I really appreciate that. And I wanted to actually build off of what you were just saying in terms of, I know we were talking about onboarding specifically, but I'm curious to kind of hear, another question that we got was around ensuring international employees feel included. And so someone asked, like, what are some methods that you have used to ensure that international employees feel included, and what was the result? So kind of building beyond just the onboarding part, and then, you know, what are other methods you've seen in terms of that?
I just saw something in the comments in the chat about general onboarding and one-on-one onboarding.
Oh,
and it kind of goes back to your question too. General onboarding, you're talking to everyone as a group. And if you want to be more aware of cultural differences, you can actually have a meeting where people are presenting about what's happening in someone's culture. Because if you're constantly working the culture you're not familiar with, you might not be aware that they are certain way. For example, Asians in general tend to be a little bit more shy, especially some cultures. They may avoid eye contact with someone who's more senior to them, or they may be more reluctant. Sometimes women too, they're taught to not shine too much and then boast about themselves so much. And that could then be an issue because they see, oh, this person's they're not going to be working as hard to do advancements in their position at work. So it's good to have, for example, if you have that kind of culture where on Fridays you get to know people one-on-one and they can tell people about their own culture, and that way you're more aware of what's happening in that culture. And also to not put someone on the spot, we can then have the whole company say, well today is which culture day? And then everyone in the company can present something they learned about the culture, so that if I'm the only Asian person in that company, I don't feel I am representing all of Asia. And now it's cultural meeting and cultural day. I have to talk about Asia, and I have to think about what's the best way to represent Asia. That's a little bit too much of a responsibility for one person, especially if they're the only person on that team from that country or that culture. So if you have saying, well, this Friday we're going to focus on Asia, everyone has to learn a bit about Asia, and then present that at that meeting so that they're more aware about how they communicate. For example, say, how can you better communicate with people who are Asian? What are some issues that are happening now with Asians that could affect them? Or what do you notice about people who are Asian in the workplace? And how do they show respect? How can you communicate better with them? They might be as boastful or this or that. So if you have it, everyone is talking about the same culture, you don't feel as on the spot to represent yourself. And they're just saying, and also if it's not your culture, you get to learn more about another culture if you're putting yourself in their shoes and saying, okay, how can I learn more about this and present it at the meeting, get to know more about it. And so onboarding is more like a general thing for, I don't know what the comment went, everyone at the same time, but also one-on-one to get to know that person and what they're like. So some people are just very shy and they say, well, I don't like being on Zoom. I don't like having my face on the camera. I have an idea and I want to say something, I have an opinion, but I feel really reluctant to put my hand up or just start shouting in front of other people, especially with Zoom, you have one person at a time. So if you get to talk to them one-on-one for the onboarding, then that helps them to say, how can I help you? Or what are some of the best ways to work with you? And they'll say, well, I don't like being on camera. Well, it's a company policy, so how can we help you out a little bit? Or if they say, I have lots of ideas, but I don't like sharing it. Okay, I know Vanya doesn't like sharing ideas in a huge group setting. She feels intimidated. So then as her supervisor, someone working with her, I'll say, all right, everyone's shared their ideas now. Vanya, do you have something to contribute? And then she feels less intimidated that way, when you know that she works better or this person works better if you ask for their opinion instead of just waiting for them. Instead of saying, if they're intimidated in a group, you don't say, oh, she never contributes, she doesn't have any ideas. She's not paying attention, she's not listening. It's not true. They're paying attention. You just feel intimidated to say something unless you call on them. So that's why that one-on-one onboarding is important, to get to know how to work with that person.
And I love what you mentioned about like having the education piece be on everyone, right? So it doesn't end up being like one person feeling like they have to represent an entire country or a continent, right? If there's like not, like that's a lot of pressure. And
It is.
And we've been talking about how individuals have our own sort of like values that are influenced by multiple cultures. So it's very difficult to just represent, one culture and be the spokesperson for it. Like that's a lot of pressure, and that's just not cool to do to someone. I also just want to flag what Vanya put in the chat, which I think is really important as well, about understanding whether people are coming from task-based society or relationship-based, right? And then being able to also take that into account with the communication and tailoring the communication medium. I think that's also like super important. And that goes back to what you were saying, Vanya, about really understanding different cultures, right? And like what are the things that influence different cultures, and being mindful of that, of how that might show up in the workplace.
Yeah, especially, I don't know where that comment is, but saying task-based or relationship-based, if you know that person works that way, then I've had task-based people that I work with on my team. So they like my checklist. Here's a checklist, do this, 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 and this. And they like their tasks like that. Relationship-based people, I noticed that they need more support. I do this when I'm working with. They like to check in. So they love their Zoom meetings. They love it when I ask them how they're doing. How can I support them? They like the relationship part, and then help guide them on what they're doing next. So yeah, that's very important to know how they work, so that you know how to work best with them.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a great flag, and I appreciate people raising up great points in the chat as well.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Again, you have questions, you have thoughts, please drop it into the chat. And then something else I just wanted to flag that you mentioned, Vanya, was even around having consistent touch points with folks, right? So like not even beyond just onboarding, because I think one-on-one onboarding is really important. But then beyond that, because the question came in around how do we ensure international employees like continue to feel included? And I love what you were saying about that one-on-one time to really get to know people, but making sure that it's consistent, right? Because imagine it's just onboarding, and then after that, there's no sort of one-on-one time. It's very difficult for you to really get to know someone. So I think that's also a great flag for how we continue to have international employees feel included, is having that consistent meeting spot, right? Where people don't have to like look for that time, Great. All right. So another question for you. Let's see. So, there were so many great questions. I'm trying to trying to narrow down which one we want to really focus on. So let's see. Oh, I like this one. So what are some, and just, Vanya, you have a lot of experience just kind of working in different industries and different work places. And so what are some of the main cultural barriers that you're seeing in today's workplace?
Main cultural barriers?
Yeah.
I haven't worked with that many different cultures in the workplace.
Sure.
But there's so much. I would say people are having trouble with realizing that there are different things that people bring in to the workplace. And so I think I've said what I said before. It's kind of, I feel like I'm getting to know people as an individual. Yeah, I feel like I'm going back, getting to know people as individuals, being aware of what's going on outside of the world that could be affecting their employees. For example, with the pandemic, now I'm bringing in what's happening out there, I've actually felt a little bit more insecure a bit because of how people were treating Asians in Vancouver. And so if I were to work with new people, I'd be feeling a little intimidated whenever I work with someone I haven't worked with before. So do they see me as Canadian or do they see me as Asian? Do they resent me because I'm very Asian in certain ways? And so I don't know if sometimes if they're going to not speak to me, is it because they see me as an Asian? So being aware of what's happening out in the world, I think is very good to be very multicultural so that you are aware of how it's affecting people in the workplace.
Yeah, I think that's so important also, Vanya, because we're seeing every day there's something else that's happening in the world that's like impacting people, and I think it has very real ramifications and consequences on people's mental health and how they show up to work. And I love what you said about like, we need to be more aware of what's happening on a global level, right? Especially if we have international employees, just because I think a lot of times, especially with companies that might be based in the US, it's very like the conversation tends to be very US centric, right? But we have folks who, even if they're based in the US, may have families in other places around the world, So I love that piece that you just flagged about we need to make sure that we're aware of what's happening on a global level. Like what are the events happening? And you mentioned like the pandemic, for instance, has had very real effects on certain like Asian groups, for instance, and how they're viewed and how they're seen. So I think that's a really important sort of note that you brought up. All right, I have a question that came in via the chat for you, which is, could you talk a bit about how the 4 generations in the workplace each have their own culture in terms of expectations, communications, etc.?
Back to my earlier tip, be open in communication, don't make assumptions. I found that when I work with my bosses, they tend to be older and they tend to not know as much about technology. So they have the older of doing things. And I was suggesting, well, how about recording a loom, especially when everyone's working in different time zones, so that their solution was almost the way we were trained before when we have in-person office work. Okay, meeting time, everyone get together for the meeting. Okay, now we've got people in 2 different time zones, one's 3 hours ahead of the other. So by the time I say, okay, when's the meeting? Oh, I'm going for dinner. Well, I'm going for lunch. I'm ready for the meeting. Well, I'm getting ready to end my day. And so I was saying, well, this is a bit of an issue, as I was saying to her, that because that person's ending their day and I'm still working away, it's my afternoon, they can't meet with me to show me how to learn some new procedures till the next day. So I'm just stuck. Okay, now I can't move on to in my project till tomorrow. Then they're up early, I'm still sleeping. And then they have to wait till I'm woken up. Now we can have our meeting. Now it's been delayed 12 hours. So I was saying, why not make more use of technology? Record me a loom, and then while you're sleeping, I'm working. So it is difficult sometimes. And so it's all about open communication, addressing some issues, such as in my case, it was the technology. They don't know about these types of technology and how it can help with remote teams, people working in different time zones. They don't think in that way. And I think also it is now technology is so much more prevalent that we can work in different time zones. The generation before may not have had to think that way. So don't think, okay, meeting, when can everyone meet at the same time? But that's not as convenient now, especially when I'm working with people in Asia. They're going to bed, I'm getting up. So you can't have everyone meet at the same time. It may not be convenient. So now you have things like recordings, you have messaging, so that you leave a message, they wake up, they get their message, they're ending their day, they send a message to you. So it's more open communication. What are some ways to be more efficient at the workplace when you're now dealing with a new system? Each have their own culture. Yeah, so it is respecting, once again, even though it's not about nationality, generational cultures is the same thing. How can we all work together with our differences? What are the differences? Let's identify the issues that come up because of the differences. And how can we all work together to resolve it? Such as what I gave as my example. Everyone in different time zones, different work times because of the flexibility in schedules. we need to meet. How can we get this? What are we meeting about, and how can we resolve that issue? So I need to learn how to do a procedure. How can you show me a procedure without everyone trying to get 5, 6 people to meet at the same time? So identify the problem, come up with some solutions, and not really address it as generational cultural things, but more as we have a problem here that started because of generation differences, generation cultures. Okay, that's a problem. How can we work together to resolve it?
Yeah, and I also think Pat dropped a great comment in the chat around, I've noticed too that older workers whose values are integrity, loyalty, and grit perhaps have a hard time understanding millennials who value like autonomy and job satisfaction. Like I do think that the different generations in general may have like different values, but of course, again, back to what we were saying, Vanya, not necessarily meaning that everyone subscribes to those values, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But again, back to what you were saying about being aware of like, what are the different generational like differences that may exist, and then talking to people about it, right? And you gave a great example of like time zones, for instance, or perhaps people not knowing about technology, right? So this could also be like an education
Mm-hmm.
moment where you're able to, right, like be able to kind of teach people the different ways to bridge gaps. But it all comes down to what it's funny, you're like, I always come back around. And
it goes back to the same thing.
True, right? It's like open communication is how we learn and grow and really like find out like where these barriers really exist.
Yeah, okay. And I like this respect too. And just knowing that everyone's an individual rather than saying, oh, you're a millennial, you'll operate this way.
Yep,
or
exactly.
You're this generation, you operate this way. And I found that just by just being open and not deciding, okay, I need to know how old you are so I know how you work. I just like to think of it as be open, don't judge, and say, here's the issue we have at work. How can we all work together to resolve it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that. That's wonderful. I would love to welcome the audience to kind of drop other questions into the chat. We have about 10 minutes left. And then Vanya, I want to also invite you. Are there any other, because you've been giving some amazing tips. Are there any tips that you haven't been able, or best practices that perhaps you haven't been able to speak to thus far that you would want to kind of make sure that the audience hears now?
Yeah, I did have some quick tips on creating documents, and I'll just quickly go through them. First of all, it's being logical. So especially making onboarding manuals or anything like that, especially longer documents, there is something that we know at a subconscious level, and that is how something is logically organized. So think of this the next time you're reading a form or reading a longer document in a language that you cannot understand. So if you pick up a form that you cannot read, and I ask you, where do you fill out your personal information? You're going to say here. You're going to point at the top of the form. I'll say, where do you sign your name? You point at the bottom. Even though you can't read the form, you'll just know this. So when you're creating documents for people, think about what is the most logical thing. Get into the shoes of, stand in the shoes of your reader. And think of that as next time when you're on a website, you've gone to the website, you have a question, and you go through all the FAQs, you're clicking on all the tabs, you're clicking on the menus, and you can't find the information you need. So it's all about what makes sense to your reader, to the user of your document, and design it in that way. So it's all about logic. So if you think, oh, most likely if they're going to sign something, it's going to be at the bottom of the form. Okay, if they need to know more about communication apps, for example, onboarding document, how can I figure out how to structure this document? Where are they going to want to know what communication apps are used at my company? What kind of communication procedures are there? How can I group this in a logical manner that they will look at these headings and then they will know that this section has the information that I'm looking for? Another thing that I was thinking is a tip that we didn't talk about yet is keeping it visual. So don't write a document that's just a wall of text. It's all bullets. It's all paragraphs. Break it up with headings and subheadings so that makes it easier to scan and read quickly. Use bullet points. If you can explain something in the full flow chart, then put in a flow chart. But be aware that people understand things differently. So one example that came up in one of the discussions I had was this little wavy line, and it was supposed to be wash station. what people thought was like swimming or some water thing. What you think it is may not be what other people think it is. So you could have a symbol that you use for your office, but test it on other people to see what they think it means. Also for writing, you want to use Serif Font for the body. So Serif Font is when you see the letter T and there's a little squiggly thing at the ends of the T, the curly things. That's Serif Font. And then for headings, you want to use sans serif because it's a lot easier to read. So they don't have the U, doesn't have the little things at the top. And that makes it a lot easier to read. So those are the things that would help when you're writing something to get more clear to the audience.
Can you repeat the fonts that you were recommending, Vanya?
Oh, it's not a font. It's more like a type of font. The type of font. So I always get them mixed up. So
That's okay.
Sans serif. Serif just means for the letters. They don't have the extras, like a letter U has a little squiggly at the top, or a letter T has a little thing at the end and at the bottom. That is serif font. That's best for the body because it's easier for people to read, especially if they have, never mind with English as a second language, people with reading challenges, find it easier to have all those little shape things. That's what the serif is, to read faster and not to write in capital letters. And the other one for headings would be the sans serif, so simple U. It doesn't have the thing up there and the T like this, rather than the little lines at the ends.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I had no idea. I am taking notes as well. I think that's great. I've never quite thought about, even what you're mentioning about like reading, making it easier for folks and using specific fonts. So that's great. Someone did ask if there's a slide with these tips. We don't necessarily have a slide, but this event is being recorded, so we will send out the link afterwards. So hopefully, while you rewatch it, you can kind of jot down all the great tips that Vanya has been sharing. And so we had a question come in around: do you have any tips or suggestions about how to hold others accountable to these practices so that they become part of company culture and norms?
That is
a great question.
And I was going to say, it kind of answers it, because making it a part of the culture is making someone accountable. Mm-hmm. So building into the culture so that people are saying, okay, I'm going to make sure my coworker is going to do this. That is part of the culture. I'm checking my coworkers are doing this as part of what we're doing every day in our company. You can even make it official to make it accountable. Have check-ins. So if I'm the supervisor and I'm checking in with my employee, I'll say, well, how have you been doing? Are you doing this, this, and this? We say we want to implement these new things. We're going to start implementing plain language. We're going to start implementing A, B, C, and D. Have you been doing this? And they say, no, not really. And once again, being open. Oh, so how can I help support you with this? What are your challenges? I wouldn't say why haven't you? It's almost, why haven't you been doing this? Is almost accusatory. Yeah. So I was going to stop myself. I thought that's a good example of not to say, what question not to say. You sound like you're accusing them, saying, why haven't you been doing this? But you say, okay, we want to hold each other accountable by doing this and this and this. And I notice you haven't been. So how can I help support you to do this? Or what has made it challenging for you to do this? And then when you're checking in, they know there's going to be a check-in point to make sure they're doing this, and that's the accountability. But also building into the culture, what you have in the second part of the question is part of it. When everyone is checking in each other and making sure, oh, we're talking about putting more plain language into our writing, and I noticed that you said this, and there's more than one meeting, so I would suggest this, so that they're helping to check each other that they're doing certain things.
Yeah, that's great. No, I love that. And I also love what you said about you do have to bake it into the culture, right? That's where that accountability piece comes in. Also just want to flag that we did go ahead and drop Vanya, our amazing speaker for today, LinkedIn information in the chat so that you can connect with her afterwards as well. I do want to be mindful of time. So I think we did have another question. Someone was just kind of building off of what you just asked and said, would the advice be the same for keeping your supervisor accountable? So did you have any other sort of nuances to add to your previous answer?
Yeah, and that is back to the company culture, building it in. It is a lot more difficult, especially with startups, when it's not built into the company culture. I did have a startup that I worked with, and the CEO was not open to the team's suggestions. So that's very difficult when the supervisor doesn't want to be kept accountable. So in that case, if the whole team knows, okay, the supervisor is not being kept accountable, who else can you talk to? So have someone else on the team that is respected by the supervisor that you can then say, can you speak to them about it? Start with speaking to the supervisor directly and say, I feel that when you don't do this, this is how it makes me feel, to get them aware of the issue. Still isn't being resolved, find someone else on the team, someone else who's higher up than the supervisor, bring the issue up with them. So to keep them accountable, it has to be built into the culture. And if it isn't, then you have to take the initiative yourself and be brave and start making the supervisor aware that, okay, it helps for them to be accountable and have other people on the team bringing it with them.
That's great. And then also thank you, Anne, for dropping that link in the chat of Serif versus sans serif, which is what Vanya was speaking to a little bit earlier as well. Vanya, do you have any final thoughts before we go ahead and wrap up?
No, this has been a really good opportunity to bring up these kind of things that I've been working on for so many years. And I saw a comment that they found this very useful. I'm so glad. Feel free to reach out to me. I just love talking about this. So reach out to me and I'll just keep talking. We can schedule a meeting. I could continue talking with you about it. But most importantly, the two things that just kept coming up throughout the whole hour is just be open in your communication. So anytime with cultural differences, generational differences, be open. Don't have any kind of preconceived notions. Don't come from there. Don't accuse, and just stick to the situation and don't say, you're Asian, you're like this. But say something like, I've noticed you don't really feel comfortable speaking. What can we do? And always be a team person. What can we do together to help get to point B?
I love that. I love that. And what a strong note to end on in terms
open,
of.
Don't judge. Yeah.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think your internet, whatever. I'm glad that, thank you for sharing that final point. I was just going to say, I think that final point you made about tackling it as a team is so important. And I love that. Let's end on that note, because I think it's really powerful. We never want people to feel like they have to advocate by themselves. We are here as a team. So with that, I just want to say thank you, Vanya, for being here, for sharing such wonderful tips. Thank you to the audience for being so engaged and asking some really wonderful questions. Again, Vanya's LinkedIn information is in the chat. Please do connect with her. And we hope to see you at the next Chat and Learn. Thank you all so much.